Richard Harrington straightened his tie and checked at him immediately, waving enthusiastically across the room. She was a tall, elegant woman who spoke with her hands as much as her mouth. "Richard, I'm so glad you could make it," she exclaimed, kissing his cheek. "James mentioned you were swamped with the Tokyo merger." "I wouldn't miss it," Richard lied smoothly. "The collection looks fascinating." "Well, don't just stand here with me. Explore. There's a young artist I'm particularly excited about. First major exhibition. Raw talent, completely self-taught." Richard nodded, grateful for the excuse to wander off alone. He moved through the gallery systematically, his eyes glazing over abstract sculptures and digital installations. Contemporary art had never moved him, though he'd become skilled at discussing it at functions like these. His penthouse apartment was decorated with pieces selected by an interior designer, expensive works that impressed visitors but meant nothing to him personally. He turned a corner into a less crowded section and stopped abruptly. The painting before him was different from everything else in the gallery. Not in subject, a simple autumn landscape, but in technique. Bold, confident brushstrokes captured late afternoon light filtering through maple trees. Crimson and amber leaves seemed to dance across the canvas, their edges deliberately blurred to create movement. But what struck Richard most was the distinctive way the artist had layered red and gold, creating depth that seemed to pull the viewer into the forest. His heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized that technique, had developed it himself decades ago when he painted secretly in his college apartment. Long before Harrington Industries consumed his life, before his father died and left him the family business, before responsibility crushed his dreams of becoming an artist. Richard moved closer, examining the corner where the signature should be. Instead of a name, there was only a small symbol, two interlocking brushes forming a heart. His knees nearly buckled. That was their symbol, his and Elena's. Memories flooded back, memories he'd locked away for 30 years. A sun-drenched studio apartment in Boston. The smell of coffee and linseed oil. Elena's dark curls falling across her face as she sketched. Her laughter when he complained about his business classes. The way she looked at him when he painted, like he was creating magic. "You're the only one who sees the real me," he'd told her once. "Because you only let me see it," she'd replied. Richard hadn't thought of Elena in years. Not consciously, anyway. After their breakup, after he'd chosen his father's approval and the security of the family business over an uncertain future with her, he'd thrown himself into work. Marriage to Catherine, the appropriate daughter of his father's business partner, had followed. Then children who grew up barely knowing him, a divorce, and the hollow success of becoming one of Boston's wealthiest men. It's quite something, isn't it? Richard turned to find Margaret beside him, studying his face with curious interest. "Who painted this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Luca Bennett. He's actually here tonight. Rather shy, keeps to himself. But absolutely brilliant, don't you think? Such an unusual technique." Richard could barely focus on her words. Bennett wasn't Elena's last name. It had been Rossi. Italian-American, with fire in her eyes. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. When he turned to reach for his drink, Richard caught his profile. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same straight nose, the same angle of the jaw that Richard saw every morning in the mirror. Richard approached slowly, his heart in his throat. The young man noticed him and paused mid-sentence. His eyes, Elena's eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold, widened slightly. "Mr. Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "I didn't expect to see you here. You know who I am?" Richard asked, accepting the handshake. The young man's grip was firm, his palm calloused from holding brushes. "Everyone in Boston knows Harrington Industries." His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Richard gestured toward the painting. "Your work is extraordinary. The technique, it's unlike anything I've seen." A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, or challenge, crossed Luca's face. "My mother taught me. She said every brushstroke was a clue for my father, in case he ever tried to find us." The room seemed to tilt. Richard stared at the young man, at his son, and saw 30 years of absence in the careful distance between them, in the guarded expression, in the quiet dignity that reminded him so much of Elena. "Your mother," Richard whispered. "Is she here tonight?" Luca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Mom passed away last year. Breast cancer." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Elena, gone. The vibrant, passionate woman who had colored his world so briefly but so completely. Gone without his ever seeing her again. Without his knowing she had been ill. Without his having the chance to tell her, what? That he was sorry? That he had made the wrong choice? That the success he'd achieved had never filled the space she left? "I'm sorry," Richard managed. "She must have been extraordinary." She was, Luca confirmed, a hint of pride warming his voice. Single mother, working 2 jobs while building her career as an art restorer. Still made time to teach me everything she knew. Richard noticed they had drawn attention. Margaret Wheeler was watching them curiously from across the room, and several patrons were glancing their way, recognizing the wealthy businessman talking to the night's featured artist. This wasn't a conversation for public consumption. "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment?" Richard asked quietly. "I'd like to speak with you privately." Luca hesitated, then nodded. "There's a small courtyard behind the gallery." They made their way through the crowd, Richard nodding mechanically at acquaintances as they passed. The night air was cool and crisp, typical of Boston in early October. The courtyard was empty, lit only by string lights draped across bare-branched trees. For a moment, neither man spoke. "How long have you known?" Richard finally asked. Luca leaned against the brick wall, hands in his pockets. "That you're my father? Mom told me when I was 18. Not before. She didn't want me growing up resenting you or defining myself by your absence." Richard absorbed this. Elena had protected him, even after he'd chosen his father's business over her. Even after he'd told her his family would never accept a struggling artist as his wife. Even after he'd suggested her pregnancy might be a ploy to trap him. "She never tried to contact me," Richard said. honest. They re-entered the gallery separately. Richard made his way to Margaret, complimented the exhibition, and made his excuses to leave. As he retrieved his coat, he glanced back at Luca, now surrounded by admirers discussing his work. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room. No acknowledgement passed between them, but something had shifted. A door had opened that had been closed for 34 years. In the back of his town car, Richard loosened his tie and stared out at the city lights. "Home, sir?" his driver asked. "No," Richard decided suddenly. "Take me to the storage facility in Cambridge." The Cambridge storage facility was climate-controlled and heavily secured, housing valuables for Boston's wealthiest families. Richard hadn't visited in years, though he paid the annual fees without question. The night manager recognized him immediately, scrambling to assist despite the late hour. "Unit 317, please," Richard said, following the manager through the maze of identical corridors. His heart pounded as the man unlocked the door and stepped aside. "I'll be at the front desk if you need anything, Mr. Harrington." "Thank you. I'll find my way back." When the footsteps faded, Richard flipped on the light and entered the storage unit. It wasn't large, perhaps 15 by 20 feet, and contained only a few items: furniture from his first apartment, boxes of financial records, and, in the far corner, a large object draped in cloth. Richard approached it slowly, feeling like a trespasser in his own past. With a deep breath, he pulled the cloth away, revealing an easel and several stacked canvases. Carefully, he began examining them: landscapes, cityscapes, and portraits he'd painted during his college years. The work was good, better than he remembered. He'd had genuine talent, once. At the bottom of the stack, he found what he was looking for: a portrait of Elena. She sat by a window, afternoon light catching her dark curls, her expression thoughtful as she looked toward some unseen horizon. He'd captured her perfectly: the slight furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the hint of a smile that always played at the corners of her mouth. "Luca," Richard whispered, tracing the edge of the canvas. He remembered now. They had chosen the name together one lazy Sunday morning. Hypothetical children, a safe topic for a couple not quite ready to discuss marriage. "If it's a boy, Luca," Elena had said, curled against him. "After my grandfather. Luca Rossi," Richard had mused. "It has a nice ring to it." "Luca Harrington," she corrected, smiling up at him. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But in the end, he'd been neither. Luca Bennett, a name constructed to hide rather than reveal his lineage. Richard carefully rewrapped the canvas and returned to his car. "Home now, sir?" his driver asked. "Yes." Richard pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen, unsure what to do next. Did Luca expect him to call? Was there a protocol for reconnecting with the son you never knew you had? By morning, Richard had barely slept. He showered, dressed, and arrived at his office an hour earlier than usual. Sarah greeted him with surprise and a cup of coffee. "You're here early. How was the gallery opening?" "Illuminating," Richard replied. "I need you to clear my schedule for this afternoon." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Then knocked again. No answer. He was about to leave when the door across the hall opened and a young woman with electric blue hair emerged. "Looking for Luca?" she asked, balancing a large portfolio case. "Yes," Richard admitted. "Is he usually here this time of day?" "Tuesdays he teaches at the community center until 4. She gave him an appraising look. "You're Richard Harrington, aren't you? I recognize you from the Business Journal." Richard nodded, uncomfortable with being identified. "I'm Zoe," she offered. "Luca's neighbor and occasional model. He mentioned he met you last night." "Did he tell you who I am?" Richard asked cautiously. Zoe's expression softened. "That you're his father?" "Yeah, he did. We don't have many secrets around here." Richard wasn't sure how to respond to this casually delivered confirmation of his paternity. The community center's on Webster Avenue, Zoe continued, seemingly taking pity on him. About 6 blocks that way. He teaches kids art classes. You might catch him if you hurry. Thank you, Richard said, turning to leave. Mr. Harrington? Zoe called after him. He's a good guy. The best. Whatever you're planning, just remember that. The implication was clear. Don't hurt him. Richard nodded, acknowledging both her warning and her loyalty. The Webster Avenue Community Center was a modest brick building with a colorful mural spanning its facade. Inside, a receptionist directed Richard to a classroom at the end of the hall. Through the small window in the door, he could see Luca moving among a dozen children, bending down to help a small boy with his painting. Richard watched silently, struck by the gentleness in Luca's interactions. He spoke to each child with complete attention, as if their artistic efforts were of profound importance. It reminded Richard of how Elena had once encouraged his own work, with reverence for the process rather than criticism of the result. When the class ended and parents arrived to collect their children, Richard stepped back, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? What did he hope to accomplish? He had lived 58 years without being a father to this man. Perhaps it was too late to start now. He was about to leave when Luca emerged from the classroom and spotted him. Richard, he said, clearly surprised. How did you find me? My assistant, Richard explained awkwardly. I hope it's not an intrusion. Luca studied him for a moment, then shook his head. No, I'm just surprised to see Boston's busiest CEO at a community center on a Tuesday afternoon. I wanted to talk, Richard said. About Elena. About you. If you have time. Luca glanced at his watch. I need to clean up the classroom, but after that, there's a decent coffee shop around the corner. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a small cafe that couldn't have been more different from the upscale establishments Richard frequented. The tables were mismatched, the chairs worn but comfortable, and the barista greeted Luca by name. Come here often? Richard asked, attempting small talk. Every day, Luca confirmed. My apartment's upstairs. One of the benefits of gentrification, artists get priced out of their studios, but at least we get decent coffee. Richard winced at the casual reference to financial struggles, something he had never experienced and had protected his acknowledged children from. I visited my storage unit last night, he said, deciding direct honesty was the best approach. company letterhead still visible at the top, though faded now. He unfolded them carefully and began to read. Richard turned away, unable to watch Luca's reaction. He knew every word of that letter by heart. My dearest Elena, I've started this letter 100 times over the years, never finding the right words. Perhaps there are none. How do you apologize for throwing away the most precious thing in your life? How do you ask forgiveness for wounds that may never heal? My marriage has ended. I won't insult you by claiming to be heartbroken about it. Catherine and I made a sensible match that pleased our families and eventually produced 2 children who are strangers to me. We lived separate lives under the same roof until even that charade became too exhausting to maintain. I've thought of you every day, in quiet moments at my desk, in the gallery openings I attend out of obligation, in the precise moments when business success feels most hollow. I wonder where you are, what you're doing, if you ever think of me, if you had our child. Yes, I know the pregnancy was real. I knew it then, too, though fear made me cruel. I've imagined our child, a boy with your passion or a girl with your talent. I've wondered what name you chose, what stories you've told about me, if any. The company has consumed me, as you predicted it would. I haven't painted in years. Haven't wanted to. The brushes remind me of you, of us, of everything I sacrificed for a legacy I've come to resent. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you should. Perhaps it's selfish of me to seek you out now, to disrupt whatever life you've built. But I had to try. Had to tell you that you were right about everything. That I made the wrong choice. That not a day goes by when I don't wonder what might have been. If there's any part of you that could consider seeing me again, even just to talk, please contact me. My private number is below. If I don't hear from you, I'll understand. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. I loved you then. I love you still. Whatever happens, please know that. Always yours, Richard. Richard heard the rustle of paper being refolded. He turned back to find Luca staring at him. His expression softened. She never knew, Luca said quietly. Never knew you looked for her, that you regretted your choice. Would it have mattered? Richard asked. If she had. Luca considered this. I don't know. By the time you wrote this, she had built a life for us in San Francisco. Had her restoration business, her friends, her community. It might have been too late. He paused. But I think it would have healed something in her, knowing you cared. Richard nodded, accepting this. Some wounds could never be fully healed, only acknowledged. There's something I haven't told you, Luca said after a moment. About why I came to Boston. I thought your mother arranged it, Richard said, confused. That's part of it, Luca acknowledged. But not all. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small USB drive. When Mom knew she wouldn't recover, she recorded messages for me. Things she wanted me to know, memories she was afraid would be lost. In one of them, she talked about you. Richard felt his breath catch. What did she say? That she forgave you years ago. That leaving Boston was the hardest and best decision she ever made. That she hoped someday I'd find you, not to demand anything, but to close a circle. Luca wasn't the type to hold grudges. She always said they took too much energy that could be better spent painting. They stood together in the storage unit, surrounded by the physical remnants of Richard's abandoned path. Canvases that would never hang in galleries, brushes that had dried out decades ago, a portrait of a woman preserved in time. Would you like to get lunch? Richard asked suddenly. I know a place nearby. Nothing fancy, just good food. Luca hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. As they walked to the door, Luca paused for one last look at his mother's portrait. Would it be possible to have this copied? I'd like to have her face from this time. It's yours, Richard said immediately. The original. I'd like you to have it. Luca started to protest, but Richard shook his head. Please. It belongs with you. I've kept it hidden away too long. For the first time, Luca's careful composure broke completely. He blinked rapidly, turning away to hide the emotion on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "That means a lot." At lunch, they talked more freely. About Elena, yes, but also about Luca's childhood in San Francisco, his art education, his struggles and successes. Richard listened, hungry for details of the life he'd missed, of the woman he'd lost. And for the first time in decades, he spoke about his own passion for painting, about the dreams he'd abandoned. "It's not too late, you know," Luca said as they finished their meal. "To paint again." Richard smiled sadly. "Some skills fade if you don't use them." "The technique might," Luca acknowledged. "But not the eye, not the instinct." He hesitated, then added, "I teach a private class on Thursday evenings. Just a few students, mostly middle-aged folks looking to reconnect with creativity. You'd be welcome to join." The invitation hung between them, tentative, hopeful, terrifying in its possibilities. "I might take you up on that," Richard said after a moment. "Thank you." They parted with a handshake that lasted a beat longer than necessary. Not quite an embrace, but a promise of something evolving. Something that might, with time and care, grow into a relationship neither had dared to hope for. Richard waited until Sunday evening to watch Elena's message. He sat in his home office, lights dimmed, a glass of Macallan 25 at his elbow. The house was silent. His housekeeper had left hours ago, and the brownstone's thick walls muffled the sounds of Beacon Hill traffic outside. He slid the USB drive into his laptop, hands unsteady. A single video file appeared. For Richard, 2023. Last year. Recorded during her final months. He hesitated, cursor hovering over the file. What right did he have to this final message? What could Elena possibly want to tell him after all these years? With a deep breath, he clicked play. Elena's face filled the screen. Her hair was short now, streaked with silver. Lines framed her eyes and mouth. Evidence of laughter and worry in equal measure. Despite the obvious toll of illness, her eyes remained unchanged. The same dark, expressive eyes that had once looked at him with love, then hurt, and finally resolve. "Richard," she began, her voice huskier than he remembered but still unmistakably hers. "If you're watching this, it means two things. I'm gone, and Luca found you." She smiled slightly. "You weren't ready for fatherhood. That's all." Elena paused, taking a sip of water from a glass beside her. "What he doesn't know, what I never told him, is that I reached out to you once. About 5 years after I left Boston. Luca was starting kindergarten, and I suddenly felt he deserved to know his father. I called your office." Richard froze. He had no memory of this. "Your secretary said you were in Tokyo on business. I left my number, asked her to have you call when you returned. 3 days later, I received a call, not from you, but from a lawyer representing Harrington Industries. He explained that you were recently married and offered a substantial settlement in exchange for my signing a non-disclosure agreement." Richard's stomach twisted. His father. It had to have been his father's doing. The timing aligned with his first marriage to Catherine, an arrangement his father had encouraged enthusiastically. "I hung up on him." Elena continued with a flash of her old fire. "Changed my number that same day. Decided Luca and I were better off on our own. I mention this not to hurt you now, but because you should know the full story if you and Luca are to have any relationship going forward." She looked directly into the camera, her gaze penetrating. "I hope you'll get to know him, Richard. Not out of obligation or guilt, but because he's remarkable. Talented, compassionate, stubborn. He has your focus when he works, your perfectionism. My passion, my restlessness. The best of both of us, I like to think." Her expression softened. "I want you to know I had a good life. Built a career I loved. raised a son I'm proud of, found joy in small things. I don't regret leaving Boston. I only regret the pain our choices caused on both sides. Elena leaned closer to the camera. If you're still the man I once knew, the one who painted beside me in that tiny apartment, who saw beauty in unexpected places, then you'll understand why I engineered this meeting between you and Luca. Not for money or advantage, but because some circles need closing. Some connections, however damaged, deserve acknowledgement. She smiled then, the same smile Richard had captured in his portrait decades earlier. Goodbye, Richard. Be kind to our son. Be kind to yourself. Life is too short for regrets. The screen went dark. Richard sat motionless, tears streaming down his face. The familiar ache of loss mingled with something new, gratitude for Elena's final gift of understanding, of absolution. He watched the video twice more before closing his laptop. Then he called his son, his acknowledged son, Peter, and asked if they could meet for breakfast the next day. It was time for some honesty there, too. Peter Harrington arrived at the Four Seasons precisely on time, dressed in a tailored suit nearly identical to his father's. At 32, he had already achieved the position of CFO at Harrington Industries, handpicked by Richard to eventually succeed him. Their relationship was cordial but formal, built on mutual respect and shared ambition rather than emotional connection. "This is unexpected," Peter said after they ordered. "Quarterly reports aren't due until next week." "This isn't about business," Richard replied, stirring his coffee. "It's personal. Family matters." Peter's eyebrows rose slightly. They rarely discussed anything outside of work. "Is everything all right? Your health?" "I'm fine." "Your family. And because I'm tired of secrets. They've cost me too much already." Peter was silent for a long moment, processing this information with the same methodical approach he brought to business problems. "Does this change anything? For the company, I mean." "No," Richard assured him. "Your position is secure. Your inheritance, your future role as CEO, none of that changes." "What do you want from me?" Peter asked, not unkindly. Richard considered the question. "Nothing specific. I'm not asking you to embrace him as a brother or welcome him to Sunday dinner. I just wanted you to know, and to understand if I seem different in the coming months." "Different how?" Richard smiled slightly. "I've joined an art class. On Thursday evenings." Peter's surprise was evident. "You paint?" "I used to," Richard said. "A lifetime ago." They finished their breakfast with talk of more comfortable topics. Business projections, Peter's upcoming vacation, a charity gala both were attending. As they parted outside the restaurant, Peter surprised his father with a brief but genuine embrace. "I hope your art class goes well," he said. "And father? I'd like to meet him sometime." "This Luca. I think that could be arranged," Richard replied, unexpectedly moved. The first Thursday evening art class was awkward. Richard arrived carrying a new set of brushes and paints, feeling like an imposter among the small group gathered in Luca's studio. There were 6 other students, a retired surgeon, a high school teacher, a young tech worker, and 3 middle-aged women who seemed to be friends. Luca introduced him simply as Richard, a returning artist, making no mention of their relationship. Richard was grateful for the discretion. He wasn't ready to explain their connection to strangers, wasn't sure he could find the right words. "We're working on still lives tonight," Luca announced, gesturing toward a table set with an arrangement of fruit, bottles, and draped fabric. "Focus on light and shadow. Don't worry about perfection. This is about reconnecting with your creative instincts." Richard set up his easel, mixed his paints, and stared at the blank canvas. It had been 30 years since he'd held a brush with creative intent. What if he'd lost whatever talent he'd once possessed? What if his hands, now accustomed to signing contracts and shaking on deals, had forgotten how to create? The first stroke is the hardest, Lucas said quietly, appearing beside him. After that, muscle memory takes over. Richard nodded, dipped his brush in paint, and hesitantly touched it to the canvas. The stroke was uneven, uncertain. He frowned. Keep going, Luca encouraged. It gets easier. And surprisingly, it did. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of observation and interpretation. His technique was rusty, his proportions sometimes off, but there was genuine pleasure in the process. In mixing colors, in solving the puzzle of how to translate three-dimensional objects onto a flat canvas. By the end of the 3-hour session, he had produced a competent, if uninspired, still life. Luca examined it thoughtfully during the group critique, pointing out strengths and suggesting adjustments with the same careful attention he gave all his students. You have a good foundation, he said. Strong understanding of composition. The technique will come back with practice. Richard felt ridiculously pleased by this professional assessment from his own son. Thank you. I'd like to continue, if that's all right. Same time next week, Luca replied with a slight smile. As the weeks passed, their relationship developed cautiously. They kept their connection private during class, maintaining a teacher-student dynamic in front of others. But occasionally, they would grab a beer afterward, talking late into the evening about art, about San Francisco, about Elena. Never about the lost years or what might have been. Those paths were too painful to explore, but about the present, about their shared passion for creating. In his home studio, newly established in what had been a rarely used sitting room, Richard began experimenting with his old technique, the layering of red and gold that Luca had recognized at the gallery. His first attempts were clumsy, but gradually, the skill returned. Sometimes, late at night, he would talk to Elena as he painted, telling her about their son, about his rediscovered joy in creation, about his regrets and his hopes. One evening in June, nearly 6 months after their first meeting, Luca canceled class unexpectedly. When Richard called to check if everything was all right, Luca asked if he would come to the studio anyway. There's something I want to show you, he said. Richard arrived to find the studio transformed. The usual classroom setup had been replaced by a series of large canvases arranged in a circle. Each depicted the same scene, a man and woman painting together in a small apartment, but from different perspectives and in different styles. What is this? Richard asked, moving slowly from canvas to canvas. A project I've been working on, Luca explained. Based on stories Mom told me about your time together. About the apartment where you used to paint. Richard stopped before one canvas that showed the scene from above, as if the viewer were looking down through an invisible ceiling. The two figures were clearly visible, a young man with dark hair bent over an easel, a woman with wild curls watching him with evident love. This is remarkable, Richard said softly. How did you? I've imagined this scene my whole life, Luca admitted. The two of you, together, creating. It's the origin story Mom gave me. Where I came from. Where my art came from. Richard moved to the next canvas, which showed the same scene, but focused on the woman's face as she looked at her companion. The expression Luca had captured was so precisely Elena's that Richard felt his chest tighten. She loved you, Luca said quietly. Never stopped, I think. Even when she built a new life without you. Richard nodded, unable to speak. I made these for you, Luca continued. All except one. He pointed to a canvas covered with a cloth. That one's for me to keep. But the rest, they're yours if you want them. Luca, I can't accept. Yes, you can, Luca interrupted. Because they're as much your story as mine. As much your art, in a way, as they are mine. Your technique, your vision, filtered through my hands. Richard looked around the studio, at this gift his son had created for him. At this bridge between past and present. Thank you, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I don't deserve this. Maybe not. Luca agreed with the blunt honesty that reminded Richard so much of Elena. But it's not about deserving. It's about forgiving. Moving forward. He stepped closer, hesitated, then did something he'd never done before. He hugged Richard briefly, but firmly. Mom would be pleased, he said as he stepped back. To see us here. To know her plan worked. For the first time since they'd met, Richard felt something settle in his heart. A piece of himself he hadn't realized was still missing, finally coming home. Autumn arrived with a crispness in the air and a gradual shift in Richard's life. The changes were subtle at first, leaving the office earlier on Thursdays for art class, spending weekends in his home studio rather than catching up on work, mentioning Luca casually in conversations with colleagues and friends. The name felt foreign on his tongue initially, then increasingly natural. Peter met Luca for dinner in July, Not bad for an amateur, Luca teased as they left. Told you the story would interest them. Corporate titan returns to abandoned artistic roots. Is that how you see it? Richard asked, suddenly serious. A publicity angle? Luca stopped on the gravel driveway, turning to face him. No, that's how they might market it, but that's not what matters. What matters is that you're painting again, that you're whole again. Richard nodded, struck by how well this young man understood him after less than a year. Better, perhaps, than his acknowledged children ever had. Better than he had understood himself. The following week, Richard met with his executive team and announced his intention to transition to chairman of the board over the next year, stepping back from day-to-day operations. The news was met with surprise, but not shock. At 58, he was approaching the age when such transitions were expected. What no one anticipated was his recommendation that Peter be groomed to take over as CEO rather than the more experienced COO, who had long been assumed to be Richard's successor. Peter understands the Harrington legacy, Richard explained. But he also recognizes the need for innovation, for fresh perspectives. The company will thrive under his leadership. What Richard didn't say was that he saw in Peter some of the same creative thinking he recognized in Luca, a willingness to question established patterns, to imagine alternative approaches. The brothers were more alike than either realized, despite their different paths. As autumn deepened into winter, Richard divided his time between the company, his painting, and his expanding relationship with Luca. They began a new tradition of Sunday brunches, sometimes joined by Peter or by Zoe, Luca's blue-haired neighbor, who had become a friend to them both. Occasionally, they visited the MFA together, discussing techniques and influences with the easy rapport of fellow artists rather than the awkwardness of newly connected father and son. In December, Luca invited Richard to participate in a unique project, a collaborative exhibition with several other artists, each creating work inspired by family connections. The concept was simple but powerful, exploring how creativity flowed through generations, how artistic voices echoed and evolved across time. I can't think of a more perfect example than us, Lucas said. Your technique, filtered through Mom's teaching, then through my own development. 3 generations of artistic DNA, even though only 2 of us ever met. The project energized them both. Richard found himself experimenting with new approaches, incorporating elements of Luca's style while remaining true to his own vision. They worked separately but consulted frequently, creating pieces that spoke to each other across the divide of years and experience. The exhibition opened in February at a small but prestigious gallery in Cambridge. Echoes across time, the catalog proclaimed. 4 family narratives in paint and sculpture. Richard invited everyone. Peter and his wife, his daughter Jennifer and her husband, his executive team, even his ex-wife Catherine, who surprised him by attending with genuine interest. The gallery buzzed with conversation as visitors moved between the Harrington Bennett installation and those of the other featured families. Richard and Luca had arranged their works chronologically. Suit jacket, his posture formal but relaxed, and a younger man in casual clothes, their profiles unmistakable. The title card read simply, Second Chances. Richard felt a presence beside him and turned to find Luca. This wasn't part of our plan, Richard said quietly. No, Luca agreed. This one's just for us. For this moment. Richard studied the painting more closely, noting the details Luca had captured, the slight gray at his temples, the way he held his shoulders, the thoughtful expression on both their faces as they considered artwork together. Father and son, mentor and mentee, artist and artist, roles blending and shifting depending on the moment. It's my favorite piece in the show, Richard admitted. Mine too, Lucas said. He hesitated, then added, I've been offered a teaching position at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Associate professor, starting next fall. Luca, that's wonderful, Richard exclaimed. It's a prestigious position. You'd be excellent. It would mean staying in Boston permanently, Luca continued, putting down roots here. The implication was clear, and Richard felt a surge of gratitude. I'd like that very much. A comfortable silence fell between them as they continued looking at the painting. This representation of their unexpected connection, this visual promise of a shared future. Do you think she knew? Richard asked finally. Elena, do you think she knew we'd find this? This relationship? Luca considered the question seriously. I think she hoped. She was always an optimist that way. Believed people could surprise you if given the chance. He smiled slightly. She'd be pleased, I think. Not just that we found each other, but that we found ourselves in the process. Richard nodded, feeling the truth of this. In helping him reclaim his abandoned art, Luca had given him back a part of himself he'd thought lost forever. And in allowing Richard into his life, Luca had completed a circle Elena had begun decades earlier. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Richard said softly. Yes, Luca agreed. And she would absolutely hate us getting sentimental at her gallery opening. She'd tell us to go get a drink and talk to the critics instead. Richard laughed, recognizing Elena's practical spirit in her son's words. She would indeed. As they moved toward the reception area, Richard glanced back at the painting. At this moment, Luca had captured this new beginning neither of them had expected. Second chances were rare in life. This one, orchestrated by a woman who had loved them both enough to see beyond hurt and absence, was a gift he would never take for granted. In the soft gallery light, surrounded by the artistic legacy of the woman they had both loved, father and son continued their conversation, one that would flow between them, evolving and deepening for all the years to come.